Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely interesting and current EMET webinar. Today's webinar is going to be a little bit different, and that we are going to be interviewing Alex Traiman. Alex Traiman is a dear friend of EMET's, a dear friend of mine and Buddy's as well, who is the managing director and the Jerusalem bureau chief of the Jewish News Syndicate. He's also a phenomenal writer and actually wrote and produced the script for two films that I know of, Honor Diaries and Iranian. And I also have this distinct pleasure today of introducing, to those that don't know him already, Benjamin Whale. Benjamin Whale is the director of EMET's program for Israel's national security. He actually served in the IDF. He grew up in Israel. He was a commander and commanded soldiers on several fronts. And what's most germane for today's discussion is that he actually worked as the foreign policy advisor to Minister Yovel Steinitz, who is the energy minister in Israel. So Benji knows the Knesset in a much more granular level than I do, and this is going to be really fascinating. As we know, there is a good likelihood that the people of Israel will have to go to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years. And there has been a first reading of a bill to dissolve the government, and I think it has to go through 2 more readings. But first of all, Alex Traiman, thank you so much for being with us once again and for sharing your hard-learned wisdom. And tell me, how did we get to this place?
Well, if everybody remembers, we basically had 3 consecutive elections in a period of 12 months, in which the defining factor of those 3 elections was that Benjamin Netanyahu was unable to put together a right-wing majority government of his preferred partners. In each of the 3 cases, he was just a few Knesset mandates short of forming a full coalition with preferred partners. And even after the 3rd election, Netanyahu was sitting, I believe, on even 59 seats, just 1 short, 2 short of a Knesset majority. And really the opposition refused to budge. And Benny Gantz, who was the main challenger in that 3rd election and actually won 33 seats, which was 3 less than Netanyahu had won in that election, he faced a choice. Do we either send Israel into a 4th election in a span of 15 months, or what happened ultimately was that Benny Gantz broke his blue and white party in half, with Yair Lapid taking his Yesh Atid faction out of the party, essentially, also with Moshe Yalon, Bogi Yalon, and half of his Telem faction went into the opposition, and Benny Gantz took his 15 seats that were remaining, plus 2 from Telem, which was Tzvi Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, who we could talk about a little bit later. He took them in. So basically, Netanyahu took his opposition, cracked it in half, and then made an emergency unity government, including his right-wing partners, most of them, together with half of the opposition. And when they signed that agreement, what happened was they agreed to a rotational alignment in which, for the first portion of the government's term, that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to be the prime minister. And then in November of 2021, that Benny Gantz would become the prime minister. And at the time, everybody told Benny Gantz, you're committing political suicide. There's virtually no way that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to allow you to become the prime minister. And in fact, that's basically what's happening, that we see very clearly that Bibi Netanyahu has no intention of allowing Benny Gantz to become the prime minister, which, by the way, it's more or less in line with what the Israeli public wants, because when you do tests today, when you do polls about who's the most fit to be the prime minister, right now Benny Gantz comes in like 4th or 5th in those choices for prime minister. So the Israeli public's not very excited about having Benny Gantz become the prime minister now either. So Netanyahu basically, within this agreement that he made with Benny Gantz, it took months for them actually, or weeks rather, to negotiate the agreement. And Gantz was sure that Netanyahu would try to get out of the agreement before Gantz would become the prime minister. So there's a number of clauses which state that if Netanyahu collapses the government, that Benny Gantz becomes the interim prime minister before an election, with one exception. And the exception is the passing of a state budget. If for whatever reason a state budget is not passed, then elections are automatically called by law, but Netanyahu retains the premiership even through the election period. Now, you're supposed to pass a budget within 90 days rather of forming a coalition. And we came to that deadline, and what Netanyahu did was he kicked the can down the road and got the Knesset to sign a bill delaying the implementation of the budget until December 23rd of this year, which is next week, or 8 days from now. That date is going to come and go without a budget, and nobody's going to extend the deadline yet again. So that date will trigger new elections regardless. And what we saw last week, as you mentioned, because we're getting close to this deadline, Benny Gantz recognized that we're going to elections. So he decided to jump the gun and say that he was polling, he was voting in concert with the opposition in a vote of no confidence against the government. And that triggers a process now which starts bills to be presented before the Knesset to actually end the term of the Knesset and go to elections anyway. And that bill is going to go for its first reading on Wednesday. It was supposed to happen yesterday and then today, and now it's supposed to be on Wednesday. But basically, within the next couple of weeks, we're going to know for sure if Israel's going to elections.
Unbelievable. Benji?
Yes,
Benjamin? Yes.
Thank you, Alex, for that synopsis of Israeli elections and setting up the stage. And I'd like to ask, the first question is Gidon Sa'ar, now a former Likud member, an arrival of Netanyahu within the Likud, has left the party to form a new party. Now, how does that change the political map and the interests of the various coalition and opposition parties, in particular Benny Gantz's interest in a delayed election or an earlier one? How does that forming of a new party affect the various stakeholders in Israeli politics?
Right. So for those that are, following loosely, and it's hard to keep track of all the players, Gidon Sa'ar was likely believed to be one of the successors to Benjamin Netanyahu in the Likud party, had been a minister in government. I believe in the last elections, he scored 5th on the list of Likud members. He was the 5th highest ranking Likud. And yet in the 3rd election cycle, he opted to pose a leadership challenge to Benjamin Netanyahu and demanded a snap primary in between those 3 elections before the 3rd election. Netanyahu won the primary basically 75% to 25%. It was an overwhelming landslide. And once that happened, and Netanyahu then essentially won the election, so he didn't have too many ministries to hand out because of the agreement that he made with Benny Gantz, where Gantz's party had an outsized number of ministries in the government. This was part of the terms of their agreement. It left many Likud members unhappy. And of course, one of those Likud members that didn't become a minister was the one that challenged Netanyahu for the leadership of the party. So his path in the Likud is now blocked. I mean, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, Sa'ar is like persona non grata inside the Likud, which actually is a pattern with Netanyahu, that you see that when people try to advance their political careers and have their eyes on the top seat, that Netanyahu tries to push them away if he's not a trusted partner of Netanyahu, which Netanyahu didn't see Sa'ar as a trustworthy ally. So Sa'ar really doesn't have a path to become a minister. So he broke away from the Likud and he founded his own party, called the New Hope Party, Hatikva Hachadash party, and right now that party's polling very highly in the early polls. It's always, the polls are very early right now, and you should always follow Shimon Peres's advice regarding polls, which is the polls may smell nice, but don't drink them. So what his defection does, and Gidon Sa'ar stated very clearly that if Netanyahu wins the next election, that he will not sit in government with him. That means that he will not be a right-wing ally for Netanyahu to form a government. And what that does is two things. Number one is anybody that wants a right-wing government but wanted somebody else but Netanyahu to be in charge, that they no longer, anybody that wants a right-wing government is probably not going to vote for Sa'ar, because Sa'ar is basically saying, I'm blocking Netanyahu's path to a right-wing government. That the Likud, even after these polls with Sa'ar, is by far and away the largest party in the Israeli spectrum, according to all the polls, polling anywhere from 25 to 30 seats. Usually Likud tends to do better come election day than they do in the polls. So the fact that they're already polling still as by far the highest party is a good indication that the majority of the country still sits, well, I wouldn't say majority, but a plurality of the country still sits with Netanyahu. So, but Sa'ar's defection really follows a pattern of defections of Likud and Netanyahu allies that have said that they no longer want to sit with Netanyahu. The first one really to do this was Moshe Ya'alon, who was a former defense minister under Netanyahu, and he too was believed at the time to be the natural successor to Netanyahu. He was the defense minister. Netanyahu at the time, I think this is back in 2013, 2015, what he wanted to do was to increase the size of the coalition, and to do that, he brought in the party of Avigdor Lieberman, the Israel Beitenu party. And Avigdor Lieberman demanded the defense ministry as part of the negotiation. So what Netanyahu did was he told Ya'alon that he had to move over to the foreign ministry. Now, Ya'alon is a former chief of staff of the IDF and was a highly qualified defense minister. Avigdor Lieberman was not a former chief of staff of the IDF and was not anywhere near as close to being a worthy candidate of being defense minister. In fact, Lieberman wanted to be the defense minister in order to boost his security credentials. Now, instead of taking I wouldn't exactly call it a demotion, because foreign ministry and defense ministry are really two of the most senior portfolios after prime minister. Instead of moving over to the foreign ministry, Ya'alon resigned and said that he could no longer sit with Netanyahu. Now, this didn't affect Netanyahu too much at the time. Now, in the next election cycle, before the first election, the reason why the election was called early was because Avigdor Lieberman resigned his party from the government and took a coalition of 67 seats down to 61 and said, I'm no longer sitting with Netanyahu. Okay, and the reason why this is happening is a couple of reasons. Number one is that Netanyahu does have a hard time working with other people with strong political ambitions. This is very clear. He's a do-it-himself style candidate. He doesn't want to delegate too much responsibility to people with strong political ambitions. So many people find it very hard to work with him. He also oftentimes promises things that he doesn't make do on. For example, in the third election cycle, he presented during the campaign Nir Barkat as his preferred candidate to be the finance minister. And we know now that Yaakov Katz is the finance minister, not Nir Barkat. Also, we know that Netanyahu basically ran on the promise of annexing or declaring Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and other parts of the Judea and Samaria, which ultimately he didn't deliver. Now, he did deliver the Abraham Accords, but the promise was to apply sovereignty here. So there is a feeling that Netanyahu doesn't make good on promises, and that hurts him with political allies. But the other thing is that the left wing in Israel understands that they cannot defeat Netanyahu at the polls. They've tried time and again to defeat him, and they just can't. And the only way to defeat Netanyahu is from the right. The only way is if you can pull support away, and that's actually what's happening. And right now, what we have is a new campaign from the collective political establishment to rally together to exclude Netanyahu. They recognize that there's not going to be another Benny Gantz that's going to come out of the pool and get 30 seats in an election. Nobody's going to beat Netanyahu head to head. But you have 9 parties, basically, that are going to try to get into the Knesset this year. And who becomes the prime minister is not necessarily the one who got the most votes, but the one who's able to form a coalition. So right now you have people like Gidon Sa'ar trying to take some support out of the Likud from the right, also take the votes of Benny Gantz that now remain on the left, and to be part of an alternative coalition that may include other right-wing parties, but that would leave the Likud and the religious parties on the side with the Arabs. That's the new strategy to take down Netanyahu.
And you mentioned Boogie Ya'alon leaving the Likud party. And just to follow up on that, there have been a number of Likud members in the past who have left the Likud, formed a party. Their first polls predicted a dozen or two seats in a new government. And then over time, they shrunk to their natural size. How does Gidon Sa'ar differentiate himself from all these former Likud members, such as Ariel Sharon with Kadima, Boogie Ya'alon, Yoaz Hendel, Moshe Kachlon, and others, and maintain that power and that influence in future governments as well?
Right. I don't think that the Sharon example is a very relevant example, because Sharon was the one who was leading the Likud party when he broke away, and he actually took all the support of the country with him. And the reason why he did that was to advance a left-wing agenda after being a very hawkish right-wing Likud member. You know, he wanted to shift the direction of the country, and he couldn't do it from inside the Likud. So that's really why he left. I think that this situation is more similar to the example that you mentioned of a Moshe Kachlon, who was a minister within the Likud, but realized that he would actually have a lot more leverage if he sits outside the government. If you sit inside the Likud, the leverage belongs to Netanyahu, whoever's the leader of the party. And whatever positions he decides to give, that's really his decision. He's the chairman of the party. If you leave the party, and now all of a sudden Netanyahu needs you and your seats in order to form a government, you have much greater negotiating power. And that we saw in the previous government that Kachlon became the finance minister for bringing his 10 seats into a Netanyahu government. So I think that Sa'ar's power, his leveraging power in a future election is much greater as the head of a party that might get, right now they're polling, close to 20 seats, but that's really because he's the new shining star, that is challenging Netanyahu. People may not feel like that by the time the election comes around, but even so, even if his numbers decrease down from 18 or 20 seats to even 8 or 9 or 10 seats, that still is, you're still a potential kingmaker for a government with 8 seats, and your negotiating power is very strong. So that's really why you do that. Inside the Likud, Sa'ar was going to be buried from here on in.
Yeah, and to your point, I do believe that one of the differences between Sa'ar and many of the other right-wing parties is they have a lot of overlapping, we'll say, political interests. But I think one of the main differences is Sa'ar said from day one, and has that credibility of not sitting with Netanyahu. Bennett has said it a number of times in the past, but everyone knows that he puts the right-wing interest above that riff he has with Netanyahu, and is willing to negotiate some sort of joint coalition, whereas Sa'ar is seen as very credible these days, especially as he's known to be a rival of Netanyahu, or when he says he won't sit with Netanyahu, at least at the moment, it seems very credible. So there's no bluffing, it seems, from Sa'ar's part. And I think that would be very crucial for Sa'ar to capture some of those floating votes on the right who want a right-wing government but don't want Netanyahu. But then, as you mentioned earlier, that would prevent a right-wing government and prevent Netanyahu from forming one. So
right, there's
it's a
no
double-edged
right-wing
sword.
government without the 25 to 30 seats of the Likud. That's a mathematical impossibility. Don't forget that Benny Gantz ran 3 consecutive elections in a row, promising never to sit with Netanyahu. And ultimately what he did was sit with Netanyahu. So Sa'ar can make those promises now, but until we find out which of the parties can put together their mathematics in order to form a coalition and who might sit at the top of the coalition. One of the big challenges of the new strategy, which is to have smaller parties band together to take out Netanyahu, is you might have a candidate that wins 12, 13, 14 seats and be the largest of the small parties and saying, I want to be the prime minister. And then you might have another guy with the same amount of seats or 2 seats less saying, I want to be the prime minister, right? So let's say, for example, Yair Lapid, who I would call the most left wing of the potential prime ministerial challengers, comes out holding the lion's share of the sort of opposition to Netanyahu mandates. Does Sa'ar say, well, I'll be number 2 under Yair Lapid, when he could be number 2 under Netanyahu and get a king's ransom from Netanyahu for doing that, in the same way that Benny Gantz received a king's ransom for cracking his party in half and going in with Netanyahu. And like you said, the concept of having a right-wing government, to those on the right wing, perhaps has never been more important. I mean, there are what I would call at least 3 major strategic issues that need to be dealt with by the next government. The first is the one we've known for a long time, which is Iran, Iran, and Iran. Okay, and we know that Netanyahu has dealt harshly with Iran, both in international forums, but also striking Iranian interests in Syria, but also in covert operations inside Iran itself. So there is a war of sorts that is a cyber war, a covert war, an economic war, and a diplomatic war, all taking place against Iran, and Netanyahu has been leading that for the last many years. So the question is, do you want to hand over that problem to somebody less experienced? That's number 1. Number 2 is the Abraham Accords. Okay, the Abraham Accords are a major paradigm shift diplomatically for the state of Israel. And when you see what's happening in the United States, the mass confusion, we're seeing here in Israel that the value of the dollar is decreasing rapidly against the shekel. And I think that we should be prepared in Israel that the economic strength of the United States will continue to decline. We see that the Biden administration talks about pushing a different agenda, that they might go back into the JCPOA. And so it's really important for us to keep the Abraham Accords momentum going. The peace train, as they call it, has left the station, and we want it to hit the next station, and the next station, and the next station. These relationships have been built by Netanyahu. So the question is, do you want to hand over this major strategic direction to somebody less experienced? And then the third, of course, as I already referenced it a little bit, is the Biden administration. The Biden administration has already announced that they will try to renegotiate the JCPOA. We know that when the Obama administration left office, their parting gift to the state of Israel was UN Resolution 2334, which called all settlements a flagrant violation of international law. Just last week, we saw 7 different anti-Israel resolutions passed by the United Nations. And it's highly plausible that under a Biden administration, that this pattern, which was broken for the 4 years of the Trump presidency, will be reinstated, where the United Nations and the Western Europeans and others will put tremendous diplomatic pressure on the state of Israel. So then again, do you hand over this diplomatic crisis that may be looming to somebody less experienced? So the ability for Netanyahu for the last 2.5 to 3 years has been operating in either transitional governments with limited power, or in a really a cobbled together unity alignment in which there was an opposition inside the government holding more hands than Netanyahu had behind his back. I mean, he's governing with 5 hands behind his back. And so if you can give Netanyahu a right-wing government, we all see that he's operating at his prime, like on top level. I mean, this year, 2020, has been a geopolitical disaster for the entire world, except for one country that managed to get out ahead in this crisis, which is Israel through the Abraham Accords, right? So you've got a prime minister here that's operating on a very high level, and if he can cobble together a right-wing government for another 3 to 4 years, we might be able to take care of the Iranian problem, to stand up to an antagonistic Biden regime, and continue the momentum of the Abraham Accords. So when you put all that on the table, Gidon Sa'ar might say, now I'm not going to sit with Netanyahu. But if the math shows that Netanyahu could form a strong right-wing coalition and that Sa'ar himself could have a outsized position in that government for bringing whatever seats he has to the table, he may ultimately decide to do what Benny Gantz did a year and a half ago, or a year ago, and say, I'm coming in even though I said I wasn't going to.
Yeah, and let's zoom in for a second into Bibi's considerations right now. And the main one that he has right now, and there's only one, is when he would like to see elections. On the one hand, if he has elections earlier as possible, he can ride on this wave of success of the Abraham Accords and all the peace agreements, bringing the vaccines to Israel even before Germany received them, and taking all of this and running with it in a campaign. But on the other hand, Gidon Sa'ar right now is polling very well, and it's known, as you mentioned earlier with Shimon Peres, that after time, that'll slowly iron out and may decrease a little. And that's why maybe Netanyahu would want, elections another 3, 4, 5 months later to allow the vaccine to affect the economy and for the Israeli population to start flourishing again. But then the flip side to that is a Biden administration where it would be harder for Netanyahu to show that if he stays in power, he'd be able to bring similar results with the Biden administration as he did right now with the Trump administration. And if you can talk a little about that dilemma that Netanyahu has and where he leans, and how, if at all, he can reach an agreement with the Blue and White Party to set an agreed date for the elections.
Well, the only real way that Netanyahu can postpone an election at this point is to pass a budget. And that budget has to be passed 8 days from now. And there's not been any progress on negotiating that budget. And right now, you have to pass a 2020 budget. We're basically going to be passing a budget for the year that's ending, plus a 2021 budget. And there's virtually no way that the sides are going to be able to negotiate that in 8 days. And Netanyahu doesn't intend to negotiate it because this is his only trigger to new elections in which Gantz does not become the prime minister. So even though you're right that maybe Netanyahu wants to stay in power as long as possible, he'll stay as a transitional prime minister as long as he can. He'll stay in this government with Gantz as long as possible. Netanyahu is essentially a one-man show. The whole government of Israel is not functioning except for the prime minister's office, and that's what people say is the problem. They say the problem is that it's only one person is really working, but as long as Netanyahu is that person, he's okay with it. He honestly doesn't care who's the defense minister, who's the finance minister. It doesn't matter. As long as he's the prime minister, he's happy. But the thing is that his only trigger to go to elections without turning over his seat is now. So you're going to have an election going to come up probably in the next 3 to 4 months regardless.
Then Benny Gantz, he also faces a dilemma. He either agrees to the election right now, and then his party pretty much diminishes, or at least decreases from the power it has right now, or agrees to extend Netanyahu's mandate as prime minister. Why isn't Gantz willing to negotiate with Netanyahu and maybe extend the current government and maybe postpone the flip of the premiership?
Well, Gantz would be very happy to pass a budget and to remain in the government to the point where he becomes the prime minister in November 2021. But that's ultimately, he's not negotiating with himself on that. He's negotiating with Netanyahu. So that's against Netanyahu's interests, so it's not going to happen. But I think that Gantz has third options, and you're going to see realignments on the center left of the spectrum in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it's very likely, and it happens all the time in these election cycles, that center-left parties merge into one another. And so I wouldn't suggest that Gantz's political career is necessarily over, even though his status at the head of the largest party is over, most likely. But he may be around for some time to come if he can continue stomach being in politics, which is not an easy career. But yeah, I think we probably didn't see the last of him.
And this is during COVID is a very, very interesting time to run elections, and especially to form a new political party. Given the current circumstances, how does a new party like Sa'ar's establish that that dominance in the media or the virtual world? Because clearly, having signs on the street is not as effective if people aren't walking around the streets. How do you form that new platform and rally people around a Facebook page or around a social media event? What would be Sa'ar's strategy in a campaign?
Well, if you look at the Israeli political map, so let's just for a moment take the ultra-Orthodox parties and put them on the side, because they're going to vote for the ultra-Orthodox parties. They don't care about any of the other interests. Same thing with those that vote for the Arab parties, okay? Now, that takes out of the spectrum 25 seats, 25 to 30 seats off to the sides that almost don't count in terms of this question. But for the rest, okay, there's basically at this stage in the game, I would say two major factions. Factions that want Netanyahu to continue to be the prime minister, and factions that don't want Netanyahu to continue to be the prime minister. We used to call that right wing and left wing, but we can't really call it that anymore because we see now so many defections from the right wing into the anti-Netanyahu camp. So now the media in Israel, very similar to the media in the United States, is in the camp of anti-Netanyahu. They don't want Netanyahu. So we saw that a few weeks ago, Naftali Bennett was polling very highly because he was attacking Netanyahu for his handling of the coronavirus crisis, which is, we see that in every country in the world, the opposition attacks the person that's at the head dealing with the crisis. And because he started to gain traction a little bit in the polls, the media jumped all over that. And they want to push other people up. And if the media feels like Sa'ar is an important component of the puzzle to unseat Netanyahu, they're going to do his work for him. And there's people already saying, we want to vote for somebody that's not Netanyahu. So who's that going to be? Well, Gantz told us he wasn't going to sit with Netanyahu, and he looks terrible, and we're not going to vote for him again. So where are we going to vote for? If Sa'ar sounds like he's a good candidate and he gets out on the campaign trail, remember, Israel's a small country. You can campaign from top to bottom of the country in 2 weeks. It's not hard to do that. So I think that the media is certainly going to help him get the traction that he needs.
And I also think that given the list that he's slowly forming right now with Yifat Shasha Biton, a former Kulanu party that was folded into the Likud, and then Hendel and Hauser, who are former Netanyahu aides and Likud by heart, it does seem that that Sa'ar's future political party will closely align with the ideals of the current Likud party. The only difference would be that the head of the new party is not named Netanyahu, it's named Sa'ar. And I'm wondering how would the traditional Likud members who are sitting on the fence read into this, as Sa'ar as being a traitor of the Likud, or as being the answer to some of the Likud's problems that they've had of having Netanyahu for more than 10 years. How do the Likud voters view this move of Sa'ar?
Well, if you look at the statements of Hendel and Hauser to come into Sa'ar's party, they're not defecting from the Likud now. Okay, they were already sitting with blue and white. They entered this government with blue and white. In fact, Benny Gantz actually fired the two of them from their positions this week when they announced that they're going to enter into Sa'ar's party. So taking Handel and Hauser are taking votes that already existed outside of Netanyahu's support base with him. And right now, the only person, now this might change, but today, the only major player that's left the Likud is Sa'ar himself. And as we saw in the primary, 75% of the party voted for Netanyahu to stay at the helm. But that means that you have like maybe a maximum 25% of the Likud voters that would go for Sa'ar, except if Sa'ar says there's no chance I'll sit with Netanyahu, which basically means he's going to be sitting with left wing and other parties in order to form a government, and you're not going to have a right wing government. So they may take that into consideration and say, yes, I would want Netanyahu to be replaced by somebody else. But if Netanyahu is still running at the head of the largest party, we want a right-wing government. So we have to see how that factors into the, and we'll know more in internal polls, I think, in the upcoming weeks as to, how Netanyahu's support base feels about it. But Netanyahu's voters are the most loyal in the country, and the Likud is the most solid political party in the country. In fact, it's the only large party that actually has a primary. Like Sa'ar's party and Blue and White and Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, they don't have primaries. Those are hand-picked lists. So the Likud, because it has primaries, it means that all the members of the Likud that want to be on that list, they are campaigning in order to gain stature on the list. And that really strengthens the Likud's position, because you don't have one person trying to recruit. You have this stable of 25 or so people trying to become ministers and enhance their position. So their jobs depend on it. So they're out there campaigning and voting, and it's and urging people to vote. And I think the Likud still remains by far the strongest political force.
And then the last question I have before I hand the mic to Sarah and then back to me for a Q&A from the audience. And this is actually something I've been wondering for a while. Over the past few months, there's been a very interesting cooperation between the Likud and in particular Netanyahu and a member of the Ra'am Ta'al, the Arab Joint List, Knesset member Dr. Mansour Abbas, who's assisted and cooperated with Netanyahu on a number of legislation and behind the scenes. What do you think the likelihood is of seeing a first Arab party, not as part of the joint list of the Arab bloc, but as an individual party in a future coalition? Do you think that there's room maybe in the next elections for Mansour Abbas to maybe detach from that bloc and maybe join Netanyahu in a future government?
Well, the bloc of the Joint Arab List are really three parties and sometimes four parties, however they align, that don't have too much in common, except that they recognize if they don't band together, they don't cross the electoral threshold. So until the law was changed, increasing the electoral threshold to basically 4 seats, all these parties ran separately. And now, in the last election, they had 15 seats, okay? And that's really important to understand, because in order to form a coalition, out of 120 Knesset members, you need 61 seats. Now, the Arab parties, the joint list, they vowed never to sit in a government with anybody, right or left. To them, they campaigned saying, there's no difference to us between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. We don't care. One's a Zionist and the other's a Zionist, and we're anti-Zionist, so we're not joining as any Zionist government. And that really stilts the coalition math in Israel, because if you subtract the 15 seats out, it means you have 105 seats that are, let's call them Zionist seats, that believe in the state of Israel as a Jewish state and a Zionist entity. Now, when you want to form a government, you don't have to get a majority of the 105. You have to get a majority of the 120, okay? But Netanyahu has a majority of the 105 in all 3 elections, but he can't get over that hump. And we've seen that the Joint Arab List grow from 10 in the first election, in the election cycle, well, rather in the second election cycle, they had 10, and the third they had 15. And that's a huge difference. Sorry, they had 15 in the third election cycle. And that those 5 seats are a huge difference in election math. If those 5 seats came out, if they were down to 10, okay, then basically, let's say that you put 2 of those seats on the left and 3 on the right of the Zionist parties, or even reverse, you put 3 on the left and 2 on the right. If Netanyahu would have had 2 of those seats, he would have formed a majority right-wing government. So these 15 seats of the joint list are a strategic stumbling block to the formation of any government by right or left. And so obviously Netanyahu sees it as strategic imperative to dismantle the joint list. And if he can pump up at least one of these parties to get out of that alignment, that could potentially change coalition math. Or also creates a situation where you might have a party that says, I'm not joining the coalition, but I'll support it from the outside, which is a much more risky proposition, but something that's been talked about more and more as it becomes harder for both sides to make a government.
Okay, Alex, I can't thank you enough. So one short question in terms of the next elections. When do you think this will come about?
Probably in March or April.
Oh,
well,
okay.
We have to stay tuned.
Stay tuned and fasten your seatbelts. When you deal with the Middle East, it's always a wild and a rocky ride. And particularly when you deal with the politics of what's going on within Israel. I've always made this allusion to an anthill with a lot of ants scurrying to get a breadcrumb, oblivious to the impending foot about to smash the entire enterprise. So what I'm hopeful is that aside from these major distractions, that Prime Minister Netanyahu or whoever will emerge will be able to focus on the real existential threats to Israel, which happen to be the exact same ones as the United States. So thank you once again, everybody. You should really support JNS. It's a phenomenal outfit, not only because they publish my articles all the time, but because the quality of the writing is tremendous and it overcomes the past biases of other services like the Jewish Telegraphic Service of the United States. So it's very important that the average reader knows there is a whole other point of view. And I would like to invite everybody to tune in tomorrow at 12 noon when we're going to have Kenneth Bromowitz speaking about his new book, The Multi-Front War, which is an incredibly interesting book talking about all of the dangers and the erosion to American values that are presented, and whether or not the Biden administration will be aware of these and challenge these things. Also, we will have Walid Faris, a dear friend of mine, who is a Lebanese Christian, and an intellect and a scholar who's written at least 4 books, talking about whether or not there actually is a conflict of civilizations, whether or not the Biden administration wants to acknowledge it. And I was just told we do have a bunch of questions that have come in. So Benjamin, do you want to read some of the questions?
Sure thing, and we've gotten dozens of questions from the audience, so I hope we'll have time to cover all of them. And Alex, I'll ask the first question that we got from an audience member is, why is the 4th election going to have any different result than the previous 3?
We don't know that the 4th election is going to have a different result than the previous 3. And really the 3 elections were by and large inconclusive. That's why we keep going to elections. If we'd have a conclusive outcome, we wouldn't be going to elections. And even this last 3rd election was a piecemeal agreement that came together probably in large part due to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, which, at the very beginning of that pandemic, it seemed like the crisis was even worse than it turned out to be here in Israel. The threat was very grave. And the feeling among these opposing parties was, listen, in the merit of this major international crisis, we just need to band together right now. But now that it's clear that Israel knows how to manage the crisis and sees a potential light at the end of the tunnel through the distribution of vaccines, it's time now to renew the political discussion, which was not yet solved at the polls, and try to solve it there. But I think at least for Israel, I know we complain about elections, and obviously we complaining about elections, but if Israel is a democracy and a hyper democracy at that, everybody says Netanyahu, he's a king, he's a fascist. You don't see any fascists taking their mandates back to the public over and over and over again. So if there's something broken in the political system, if it goes back to the people to decide, that's okay. Like, it's not the best, but it's a lot better than some of the other alternative scenarios.
The next question is, when he left his post, Israel's former UN ambassador, Dani Danon, expressed an interest in getting back into electoral politics at some point. Is this an opportunity for him? If so, where might he fit in? Has he said anything recently about his intentions?
Right. So Danon was actually sent to be the ambassador to the UN as part of one of these strategies that Netanyahu has to push people that are too close to the top a little bit far away. So he was sent to the UN for 5 years and in that time, he was certainly able to enhance his diplomatic credentials dramatically. Before he went, he was the number 2 ranking member of the Likud party, 2 or 3. So he was ranked even higher than Sa'ar. So the question is, if he could make a deal with Netanyahu to come back and receive some kind of major ministry if he comes back into government. Of course, wary of the fact that Netanyahu has told other people they would have certain positions, and then push comes to shove for whatever reasons that he doesn't make do on that. Or might he join Gidon Sa'ar? Or might he join Naftali Bennett? So we have to watch, or he may decide to sit it out as well. But yeah, I think he's definitely somebody to watch, and because he does have a following, and he can himself probably generate maybe 2 to 3 Knesset seats.
Speaking of sending a politician into exile, Gilad Erdan is in a similar situation as Dani Danon. What's the likelihood of Gilad Erdan smelling these elections and coming back and either joining Sa'ar, going back to the Likud, or?
I don't think there's any chance of that right now. I think that he's going to take over. Basically, he takes over 2 posts, which is the UN ambassadorship and also the US ambassadorship. I just read a report this week that Netanyahu was considering splitting that arrangement up and potentially sending Yuval Steinitz, a former finance minister and current energy minister, over to be the other ambassador. So we'll see what happens with that. But I do think that Erdan is probably sitting in the United States for the next 4 years.
Thank you. And what does Sa'ar have to offer in terms of how to build a thriving economy, how to continue Abraham Accords, how to deal with unstable America? Does he have the talent or the ability?
Well, that's what we have to find out. That's what the Israeli government, that's what the Israeli voters actually should be voting on. I know that there's this sort of reflexive anti-Netanyahu sentiment among many Israelis, but given the stark challenges that Israel faces, including an economic recovery from COVID, in addition to the other 3 that we mentioned, that's the question. Does Sa'ar have the capacity to do that? I would say when it comes to the economics of it, probably he's more aligned with Netanyahu and has been around for a while to deal with that. But in terms of the personal relationships with world leaders and diplomacy, and does he have the guts, basically, to stand up to President Biden when needed, or to take very controversial action, maybe against Iran? That really remains to be seen, and I think nobody knows the answer to that question.
Avigdor Lieberman was a political force to be reckoned with for quite a while, and now, after he succeeded in throwing Israeli politics into chaos, we don't hear much about him. What is his status now, and does he still have a strong following base that he used, that similar to what he used to have?
He does still have a similar base. I mean, he gets anywhere from 5 to 8 seats in elections, and he's been consistently polling over the past 2 years at the same, more or less the same amount. He has a very loyal following. And what we've seen in the last several election cycles is that 5 seats is make it or break it for one side or the other. So, I mean, it's a big problem in Israeli politics that you might have a party which is the 8th or 9th largest party entering the Knesset, but you become a kingmaker. And you can determine who's the prime minister or not. And that is it's one of the major challenges of Israel's parliamentary system, which is really proving itself to be an unstable system at best, especially in an age of polarized politics.
And regarding Naftali Bennett, what do you think about the Bennett-Sa'ar cooperation, or perhaps Donnie Danon joining some sort of mix?
Right. Well, that would certainly certainly give the right wing an option to have a right wing prime minister without Netanyahu, because if those two come together, well, and you have to look at the polls, because a lot of times what happens is that these parties, they do better in the polls when they're separate than when they're together. So right now, if you have, let's say, Sa'ar polling at 18 seats and you have Bennett polling at, let's say now 16 seats, which is already down 7 seats since Sa'ar announced his intention to run. Right now, the two of those parties together are formidable. You're talking about like 30 seats between them or something like that, and that would make them the largest party. And then they can determine who their coalition partners would be. But I have a very strong feeling that those numbers are going to come down, and especially would come down dramatically if those two parties come together. And then you also have to look at the dynamics inside Bennett's own party, because Bennett has a love-hate relationship with the nationalist factions inside his own party. You know, the settlers traditionally voting for the old National Union and the National Religious Party alliances. And let's not forget that in the second election, Naftali Bennett, he divorced himself from the right-wing factions in his own party and himself fell below the Knesset threshold. And he cost the right wing essentially 4 seats, that if he would have had those seats and brought them into the government, even 2 of them, that Netanyahu would have formed a government on the right, and Bennett would have been a big player in that government. So if Bennett will divorce again from the right-wing faction in order to make himself look more palatable towards center-right and center-left voters, that might take 4 to 5 seats out of his current polling numbers right off the bat, and that will take him down from 16 to 11. You know, just in terms of the current polling, and you put them together. So, but yes, they may be able to present themselves as a right-wing alternative, which then Israeli voters have to decide, well, do we want to have a Sa'ar-Bennett combination with one of those two as the prime minister, but in government with Lapid and Benny Gantz and the Labor Party, in which they probably are not going to allow them to maintain a strong right-wing agenda.
I agree with everything you said, and I will add that there are 2 reasons why currently I don't see such a merge happening. Number one, both Sa'ar and Bennett have the ambition to become prime minister. Sa'ar originally wanted to become prime minister through the Likud. Now he detached himself from the Likud. And I think that would there be a power struggle within this new joint party if it were to happen. And the second one, which is a very fundamental one, is realistically speaking, a joint party of Bennett and Sa'ar will not be strong enough to be a candidate to form a new government. They would have to join a government, most likely Netanyahu's, and that's where they differ. Is that Sa'ar currently is saying, I will not sit under Netanyahu no matter what, and Bennett just yesterday or 2 days ago in a conference was calling on Sa'ar not to make any rash decisions and to be open to forming any government that would bring stability to the country. So I think that given that very realistic consideration that they'd have to make in 3 months from now, I think it would prevent any sort of merge between the two. And I think that's key to any joint party between Bennett and Sa'ar. The last question that we have time for right now is, isn't the most likely coalition to be formed to comprise of the Likud, Bennett, Shas, and UTJ for 61 plus seats?
Well, that's definitely Netanyahu's preferred coalition. I mean, if that math is 61, then that's going to be your government. I mean, that's been the reality in the last several elections, and really the wild cards there are Likud and Bennett, because you basically know what you're going to get from the religious parties. They're going to come in at 8 seats, 7 seats each, put together for 15. And then the question is if you can get 46 seats from other right-wing parties. If you do, that's your government. Even a small majority government is likely to be a stable right-wing government, and that's certainly what Netanyahu is hoping for.
Wonderful. Okay. So again, Alex, we cannot thank you enough for your wisdom and for making this very complicated, convoluted, labyrinth-like system of having a government very, very explainable, very clear to us. We just can't thank you enough, and we can't thank you enough for your continuous friendship to EMET and as well as to myself.
Well, absolutely. I think that many people, they don't recognize how important EMET has been. Really working the floors of Congress and the Senate, convincing staffers and congressmen about the importance of supporting various initiatives that benefit Israel, and sometimes not supporting other very important issues which would potentially harm the state of Israel. And a lot of times I know that you don't get full credit for the work that you do. You guys are like undercover warriors for the state of Israel, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Those words mean a tremendous amount to me, Alex. Thank you so much. So we'd like to again thank you and invite everyone to tune in tomorrow at 12 noon for this fascinating discussion about the challenges that are awaiting the new administration and whether or not the administration has the ability to squarely look at these challenges and acknowledge that there are some very difficult issues, and hopefully be able to solve some of these problems in a peaceful, let's hope a peaceful way. Anyway, thanks again, and I'm looking forward at least to seeing you, Alex, next time we go to Israel, when all of us are vaccinated and we'll finally see an end in sight to the pandemic. Thank you.
Sarah.